What's up, fellas? In the second video of the day, we're going to be talking about a scenario here. Should the Clippers have never made the Paul George trade? Now, there's some specific details to this, and there's some caveats here that we need to get into, but that's basically the premise. Should they, or would they have been better off had they not made the Paul George trade? That's what we're going to be talking about in the second video of the day. But really quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy content just like this, then consider subscribing. If you're new here, by the way, what's up? My name is Tucker. I upload NBA stuff on this channel twice a day, every single day. So it's truly the most consistent NBA content on YouTube, so consider subscribing. You can also leave a like rating on the videos as well, and you can check me out at various socials in a Linktree link down in the description below. With those things said, let's go ahead and talk about the LA Clippers and Paul George. So the first thing I need to get out of the way here is currently we're operating under the assumption that Kawhi Leonard still would have gone to LA if they never made the Paul George trade. That's probably not true, but maybe it is true. We still don't fully know all the details around the whole situation. But let's just say, for example, that Kawhi is going to go to LA regardless, and they have the decision to make on whether they should make the Paul George trade or they should keep the roster the way it is. So let's talk this out. Let's say that they don't trade for Paul George. Let's say that they keep those assets. Here's what Kawhi is walking into. Basically the exact same roster the Clippers had the year before, which is a team that wasn't great but was good, and that's one of the reasons that guys like Kawhi were interested, in addition to the fact that they're in LA. And so you keep SGA, you keep all those picks that you traded away, which aren't incredibly valuable in the moment because you know that the Clippers are going to be a good team. You know those picks are going to be in the 20s, but at least it adds flexibility. You can throw a first-round pick here, throw a first-round pick there, things like that. And then Gallo as well. Danilo Gallinari stays on the roster and is probably used in a trade down the road, or he gets re-signed and is a good little scoring wing to have in that group. So now you're looking at SGA, Gallinari, Kawhi, Montrezl Harrell is still there, at least for that first season. We'll see if he ended up, you don't really know if he'd end up being re-signed afterwards. Zubac is there. You got all these different little pieces, and then there's just Kawhi at the center of it. And that concept is really interesting, not just because Kawhi is a great player, not just because that adds a lot of depth to this roster that at times they've been missing since they made the Paul George trade, but also because of what we saw Kawhi do in this context, in this scenario, the year before in Toronto. Now, Toronto had really, really good players. I mean, Van Fleet played incredibly well for the second half of the postseason. Lowry was great in the finals. Siakam had great moments. And so it's not like it was just Kawhi out there with a whole bunch of role players, right? But the concept of Kawhi as the focal point with everybody else around him kind of working around what Kawhi does potentially is more intriguing than Kawhi there with another quote-unquote star, superstar, someone like Paul George. And so that's the whole concept is, are the Clippers better off with Kawhi plus assets, SGA, Gallinari picks, or are they better off with Kawhi, Paul George, and the roster they have right now? Now, one issue I have with this is that the assumption is made that moving forward, the Clippers would still, keep all of the picks and assets and things like that they traded away for Paul George. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think it's pretty likely that at some point, Kawhi still goes to the Clippers and says, you know what, I love SGA. This team is really great, but I want someone that's more proven that I know I can count on in the postseason that fits my timeline a little bit better. You know what I mean? And so in that circumstance, you're probably just pushing off a Paul George-like trade a little bit further down the road, in which case you're still ending up with the same team, just not immediately. Now, the counter to that would be, okay, granted, I'll give you that, but because you're not making the Paul George trade at the time that you're signing Kawhi, you're not giving up as much because, again, we're operating under the assumption that Kawhi would have gone there even if they didn't trade for Paul George. The assets given up in exchange indicates that he wouldn't have gone there if they didn't trade for Paul George. But if you're just going through this exercise, you're saying, let's just say Kawhi's going there. You don't make the Paul George trade down the road. You go get a guy and you give up a lot of assets. SGA's still gone. You give up some picks, but you don't give up quite literally every single usable asset on the roster, which is a very, very important distinction. Maybe that's the argument you would make. For me personally, when I think about this situation as a whole, and I'm interested to see what you guys have to say in the comment section on this, I love SGA. And Gallinari is a player that certainly would have provided them value on the court as well as potentially as a trade asset. And it would be nice to have those first-round picks, especially now when you're thinking about the Clippers looking to make moves. Their assets are incredibly, incredibly limited because they don't have anything to trade. However, I still, and this is odd because this is not typically how I think about things, but with this Clippers roster specifically, I still would gravitate more towards the ceiling of a team that includes Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, specifically in LA, over Kawhi plus depth pieces, and here's why. When you're in LA, and I know it's not as apparent as it is with the Lakers, but when you're in LA and you're the Clippers, there are inherent advantages here that allow you to improve your team in small little ways that just are not the case with other rosters. For example, if you wanted to flip this around and say Kawhi returns to Toronto, right? And you're like, okay, well, you can make a Paul George trade and you can bring him in, or you could not. I would advocate for not making the Paul George trade in that circumstance, because Toronto's ability to upgrade in things like free agency on a discount, or in things like the buyout market, and guys that typically would not be going to that team would go there because it's in LA, because it's the Clippers and or the Lakers. And so that's something you have to consider here. So for the Clippers specifically, I would still gravitate towards making the move, towards making the Paul George trade, towards going for the ceiling of a group that includes Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, because if you need a little bit of help on the backcourt, you can find them on the buyout market, or someone can take, someone can take a discount to potentially go there in the buyout market, or in free agency, right? And you can add a Serge Ibaka for relatively cheap. You can add different guys like that because it's LA. And it's not just because you've got a chance of potentially winning a title, but because of the location that you're in, it's a little bit easier to add pieces around the edges. Whereas if you're a team like Toronto, that's simply not the case. It's not as easy to go and make moves like that. It's not impossible, right? But it's not as easy to add players like that. And thus, you'd probably rather have the depth and hope that Kawhi can do exactly what he did in 2019 with a group that features the depth that Toronto team had. So ultimately, I think it's an interesting question. I think it's one that's going to continue to be asked, especially if Paul George, has struggles in the postseason, as he's prone to do. But I would rather have the defensive capability of those two really good wings and the offensive capability of the fact that they're two of the better shot makers in the entire league from an individual standpoint, rather than hoping that SGA figures it out in the postseason and hoping that Gallinari stays healthy. Because, there's nothing necessarily saying that Shea's going to be a great postseason player. There's nothing necessarily saying that Gallinari is going to be healthy. And in that case, you would probably rather just have the proven guy. And again, I'm sure Kawhi would feel the same way. I'm sure he felt that way at the time, and that's why he wanted them to make the move in the first place. The other interesting question about this is, if you're Kawhi, did you make a mistake, not by going to LA, but by the way that you went there? If you wanted to be a Clipper, they had a really good team the year before. They didn't win 50 games, but they were close. And the fact that you essentially, reportedly, required the addition of another star or superstar on the roster in order to convince you to go to LA probably put this team at a bigger disadvantage from an asset standpoint than they would have been had you just gone there first and then later on the team gone out to go and get a star. For example, if Kawhi just says, you know what, I want to be in LA, and I understand that this roster I'm going to right now, it does not have another true superstar, but there's talent there. And I want to be a Clipper. I don't want to go on the Lakers. I don't want to stay in Toronto anymore. I don't want to stay in Toronto anymore. I want to go and be an LA Clipper. I want to go and have these huge, one-on-one battles with LeBron. Okay, cool. Go. Do that. That's clearly what you wanted the entire time. We'll go and get somebody. We will. Promise. Just, we're not going to go and get them right now, because that allows a team like Oklahoma City to have the leverage that they did in a scenario in which they knew they needed Paul George to potentially seal the deal for Kawhi, and they knew that someone like Paul George that has multiple years left on his contract is very, very difficult to get it's not super easy to trade a guy like that, even though he does request the trade. You know what I mean? So you need a lot of assets to pry him out of Oklahoma City. You need a lot of assets to convince them, hey, we know you really need Paul George, so give us everything you have. So that's the more interesting question, is not should they have made the Paul George trade. It's should Kawhi have handled the situation better so that the Paul George trade or whatever superstar trade they made down the road would not have cost them as much. I think that is the much, much more interesting question to ask here, is did Kawhi handle the situation in a way that was actually, a long-term detriment to this team? I'm interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comment section below about, would you have made the Paul George trade? Would you have kept SGA and the picks and everything? Do you think that Kawhi would have gone there if they never made the trade? Do you think that Kawhi handled it improperly? all those things we went, kind of went through in this video. I'm interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comment section below. But that is going to be the end of the second video of the day, and I thank you guys very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker, as I said in the beginning. Consider subscribing to the channel for the most consistent NBA content on YouTube. Like the videos if you enjoy them, and check me out at various socials and a Linktree link down in the description below. With all those things said, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.